I woke to a ceiling I had never seen before, a dull, pale surface that felt too quiet, too still, like a place meant for someone who had already given up. The air carried a sharp chemical sting that clung to the back of my throat, and for a few seconds I lay there listening to the hum of distant machinery, trying to understand why my body felt fine while everything around me felt wrong. A figure in medical scrubs passed the doorway without glancing in, the kind of hurried walk reserved for people who know more than they're willing to say. I forced my voice to work, called out, heard how rough it sounded as if it had been unused for days, and the figure stopped and stepped back with a practiced smile that didn't reach the eyes. The person addressed me with a calmness meant for fragile minds, said I had been there for 3 days, said the place was an extended care facility, said my stay had already been arranged. For a moment I just stared, trying to place some missing memory, but my thoughts were sharp, precise, steady, nothing like the fog they clearly expected. I sat up slowly, testing each limb, waiting for weakness or confusion that never came. There was none. Everything inside me felt intact. That only made the strangeness heavier. When I asked who had placed me here, the answer felt like a crack running down my spine. A relative had signed papers, claimed I would be disoriented at first, claimed I needed round-the-clock supervision. That lie settled in the room like dust. I insisted on calling, needing to hear an explanation with my own ears, and they handed me a cheap plastic phone that wasn't mine, a detail that made my pulse throb in my neck. The voice on the other end sounded busy, almost irritated, as if my confusion were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. When I asked why I had been placed in a nursing facility, there was silence long enough for my chest to tighten. The explanation came wrapped in half-sentences and hesitation, a story about another medical episode I could not recall, about confusion I had supposedly displayed, about a doctor who had advised full-time monitoring. None of it matched the clarity pulsing through my head. I tried to argue, but the call ended abruptly, leaving me holding a phone that suddenly felt too light, too empty. When I asked for my belongings, they brought a small bag containing nothing that mattered. My ring, my watch, a wallet stripped of comfort. No phone, no keys, no glasses. They told me the relative had taken them to avoid accidents. The lie was so thin it nearly tore when touched. I kept my face calm because panic would only feed whatever story had been written about me. Over the next 2 days, I played along, swallowing whatever pills they placed in my hand, pills that dulled the edges of my thoughts just enough to make me wonder how many doses I had unknowingly taken before waking here. I joined group activities meant for minds that drifted. I smiled at staff who spoke to me like someone fading. All the while, I watched. I counted. I observed every hallway, every locked door, every clipboard. The place was clean enough, quiet enough, full of people who truly needed care. That was what made it worse. I didn't belong among them, and someone knew that. Someone had put me here anyway. By the 3rd day, suspicion clung to everything like static. The timeline, the missing memories, the way the staff treated me as if a script existed somewhere that said I should accept this. When a neighbor visited unexpectedly, fury etched across her face. The truth began to bleed through the cracks. She spoke of a moving truck outside my home. She spoke of being told I had suffered a stroke. She spoke of being turned away when she tried to check on me. The ground inside my chest shifted as she described my house being emptied piece by piece, the life I had built being packed away under false pretenses. It was then, as she looked at me with disbelief and fear, that I understood something far darker was unfolding. I had not been placed here for care. I had been removed, hidden, silenced, and whoever orchestrated it believed I was too old, too confused, too broken to fight back. They were wrong. I felt the truth like a spark catching dry leaves. Something had been taken from me, and I wasn't done reclaiming it. The moment my neighbor sat beside me and lowered her voice, something inside my chest tightened, the kind of tension that comes when instinct catches danger before reason does. She said she had gone to my house days earlier and found strangers carrying out boxes. Furniture, things that had no business being in anyone's hands but mine. She said the relative who stood in the doorway claimed I had suffered a severe medical episode, claimed I would be living elsewhere permanently, claimed I had agreed to everything. I felt my pulse throb against my ribs as she kept speaking because the details were too neat, too deliberate, too rehearsed to be anything but a plan executed in silence. When she told me my home had been emptied fully, room by room, The image flooded my mind with sickening clarity. The workshop shelves, cleared without a second thought. The desk where I kept the letters of a life already gone. The framed photos I had never let anyone move. All of it taken as if I no longer existed. I asked her to bring something to write with, and she returned later with more than that, placing a laptop on my knees with a determination that reminded me I wasn't completely alone. We searched through public records, fingers trembling over the keyboard because I already suspected what we would find. When the screen showed my property listed under a different owner, transferred for a price far below its value, a kind of cold disbelief settled in my bones. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't age, it wasn't an accident. Someone had stripped me of everything while pretending to care for my well-being. The neighbor looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching, almost afraid I would slip into denial, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I told her I remembered the day I'd felt lightheaded, the suggestion to see a doctor I didn't know, the prescription that made my vision blur, the way time began to smear at the edges afterward. I hadn't connected the fragments then, but now they clicked into place with horrifying precision. She asked if I was sure, truly sure, that my thoughts were clear. I let her test me, ask facts from decades ago, ask about the neighborhood, ask about world events, ask anything she thought might reveal fog or fractures. I answered each one without hesitation, and the relief on her face told me she had needed that as much as I did. She said we needed someone who understood the system better, someone who could help pry open whatever trap had been built around me. She promised to return with someone who knew how these places worked, someone who could get an independent evaluation. After she left, I sat in the dim evening light, the sounds in the hallway blurring into an indistinct hum while my thoughts narrowed into something sharp, focused, dangerous. Whoever had done this believed I would accept it. They believed I would fade quietly inside these walls while everything I owned was carved up and sold. They believed sedation and paperwork would erase my voice. They believed age meant weakness. They forgot that some people grow harder with time, not softer. The next morning, a new person entered my room, someone younger, confident, carrying the calm competence of someone used to fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. They asked me to recount everything from the faint spell to the missing days, taking notes with a precision that made me feel, for the first time, that someone was listening without judgment or ulterior motives. They said I needed an evaluation by someone outside the facility, someone who wasn't connected to the doctor who had signed the commitment. They warned me it wouldn't be easy because people who orchestrate these situations don't leave obvious cracks. They use medical jargon and family signatures and subtle drugging to make the victim appear incapable of self-defense. But if I was as clear as I seemed, there was a way out. That night, as the facility settled into its mechanical quiet, I lay awake replaying every moment that had led me here. The missing belongings, the sedation, the forged narrative, the relatives' sudden concern, the house stripped and sold, the neighbors being turned away. None of it was accidental. None of it was benign. It was theft clothed as compassion. And the person behind it believed the world would take their side, because youth is persuasive and age is easy to dismiss. But I felt something rising inside me that I had not felt in a long time, something steady and fierce, a refusal carved from years of surviving losses that would have broken weaker people. They thought they had taken my life from me. They had only sparked the part of me that refuses to go quietly. Tomorrow the fight would begin, and I would not be the one losing. The evaluation day felt unreal, like stepping into a version of my life where everything familiar had been distorted and left just recognizable enough to hurt. The specialist who entered my room did not smile politely like the staff here. She studied me with a kind of quiet intensity, the way someone looks at a structure to find where the foundation was cracked and where someone had tried to hide the damage. She asked questions that forced me to reach far into memory, then others that tested how quickly I could think. She asked me to recall long sequences of numbers, to name objects, to describe events in reverse order. Not once did I falter. I watched her expression shift from cautious to convinced, and something loosened in my chest, a small weight removed from a pile that still felt impossibly heavy. When she said there was no sign of cognitive decline, the words hit me like a breath I had been holding for weeks without knowing it. She said the sedation in my system was not something one would receive for a simple dizzy spell. It was the kind of drug used to keep a patient docile, the kind that blurs time until days melt together. She said someone had administered it repeatedly, someone who wanted me malleable. I felt heat crawl up my throat as she described it. Not fear, anger, a deep roaring kind that grows silently under the skin until it finds a place to burn through. She said she would document everything and submit it immediately. And for the first time since waking in this place, I believed escape was possible. But escape was not enough anymore. I wanted the truth exposed, every piece of it dragged into light where the people who had done this could no longer hide behind their good intentions and soft voices. That evening, the patient advocate returned, carrying a stack of documents and a phone buzzing with messages. He explained the next steps while pacing the small room, saying that once the report was filed, the facility would have no grounds to hold me. He warned that the ones behind all of this would likely panic. People who build their schemes on lies do not react well when the lies start to crumble. They try to patch the cracks or create new ones and hope no one notices the plaster. He told me to expect a confrontation. He was right. It happened sooner than I thought. Just after noon the next day, the relative walked in as if he owned the place, wearing that polished confidence that falls apart under pressure. Beside him was the woman he called his partner. Her expression composed the way a performer settles into a role. She spoke first, with a gentle, pitying tone that made my skin crawl. She said I must be scared. She said confusion often makes patients lash out. She said resisting help would only worsen my condition. Every sentence was constructed carefully, like she had practiced them in the mirror. The relative nodded along, adding little comments meant to sound concerned, but full of cracks I finally saw clearly. When they realized I was not wavering, the softness in their voices hardened. They tried to insist that the specialist's evaluation meant nothing. They tried to remind me of conversations that never happened. They tried to insist I had signed documents I had never touched. They tried to insist they were acting out of love, that they were the only ones who had my best interest in mind. I watched the performance shift from concern to irritation to barely disguised frustration. When I asked directly whether they had sold my home, the silence that followed told me everything. The partner recovered first. She said sacrifices had to be made. She said I could not care for the place anymore. She said the sale was a blessing, a chance for a new life for all of us. I stared at her long enough that she finally looked away. The relative's voice shook when he finally spoke, insisting again that he had acted responsibly, that he had saved me from myself, that he had done what any devoted family member would do. But there was something wild behind his eyes, something that told me he knew the ground under him was starting to give way. I did not shout. I did not argue. I simply told them the truth. I said I had been evaluated. I said the report was filed. I said the facility was reviewing the paperwork. I said everything they had taken from me would be traced. The partner's face drained of color. The relative looked like someone had punched the air out of him. For a moment no one spoke, and in that silence I felt something powerful settle into me, a steadiness I had not felt in years. They left without another word, and for the first time since waking in that strange bed, I understood something clearly. The fear was no longer mine. It was theirs. The hearing felt like walking into a storm I had tasted but never fully seen. The room was cold, brighter than it needed to be, a place designed to strip excuses down to bone. I sat at the table with the attorney who had taken my case, and even though he barely spoke above a whisper, his calm carried weight, the kind that steadies the ground under a person who's had it pulled out from beneath them. Across from us sat the relative and the partner, flanked by a lawyer whose expensive suit couldn't hide the panic flickering in his eyes every time he glanced at the stack of evidence my attorney had laid neatly between us. The judge entered, stern, composed, the kind of authority that made the air shift. When the hearing began, the other side tried to perform the same script they had been rehearsing since the first deception. They painted me as fragile, declining, confused, a man who could no longer trust his own mind. They leaned heavily on the doctored evaluation from the physician who had barely spent minutes with me. They spoke of episodes, confusion, paranoia, imagined threats, invented accidents. If I hadn't lived the truth myself, the pattern might have sounded convincing. That was the terrifying part. Lies told with confidence often survive long enough to do damage. But then my attorney rose and spoke in a low, steady tone that cut through every lie like it were soft cloth. He asked the relative to pinpoint specific dates, specific events, moments he claimed I had forgotten or misunderstood. The replies began to crumble almost immediately. The relative's voice cracked when pressed on details he had assumed no one would question. He stumbled over timelines that didn't align. He contradicted statements he had made in sworn documents just days earlier. Then came the specialist, appearing on the screen with that same calm intensity she'd had in the facility. She explained my test results with the precision of someone who has no interest in theatrics. She said my cognitive function exceeded what would be expected for my age. She said there was no trace of dementia. She said the sedation in my system indicated prolonged dosing inconsistent with any standard treatment plan. She said it plainly, without emotion, as if describing a structural flaw in a machine. The committed care had no medical basis, and the room shifted. I watched the judge lean forward. I watched the lawyer beside the relative sink lower in his seat. I watched the partner's posture stiffen, as if bracing for impact. Then the attorney questioned the doctor who had signed the fraudulent diagnosis. The man arrived already shaking. Under oath he could not hide behind rehearsed lines. The questions chipped away at him until what remained was the truth: he had accepted payment for a false claim. He tried to explain it away, calling it a consultation fee, but every word only dug his grave deeper. When my attorney revealed the documented payment, the hush that fell across the room felt like a verdict all its own. The final blow came when the attorney exposed the housing transfer linked to the partner's company, showing how the purchase price had been manipulated, how ownership had been shuffled through shell companies to hide the profit. The judge's face hardened the longer she listened. When she finally spoke, her tone left no space for misinterpretation. She declared the documents invalid. She ordered a freeze on assets pending investigation. She issued a restraining order that barred the relative and the partner from contacting me or accessing a single cent linked to my name. And then she referred the entire case to the criminal division. The sound of her gavel echoed like a door slamming shut, not on me, but on them. When we walked out, the relative followed at a distance, eyes glassy, hands trembling, looking like a person who had just realized the fire he set had spread farther than he ever intended. The partner, however, moved like someone calculating, adjusting, already scanning for a strategy that might salvage what she could still steal. Outside the courthouse doors, she approached me, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. She warned that I would never reclaim the home she had taken. She warned that she would bury me in paperwork, bleed me dry with delay after delay. She warned that age was on her side and time was on hers. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Her eyes changed as she realized it wasn't fear she was seeing in me anymore. It was resolve. And resolve terrifies people like her because it means the victim is no longer on the ground. It means the victim isn't a victim at all. When the criminal case opened, it felt like someone peeled back the walls of everything they had tried to hide and let the rot spill into the light. I walked into that courtroom with a strange mix of dread and clarity, the kind you get after surviving something that should have broken you, but didn't. The prosecutor met me before the proceedings started, a woman with a voice steady enough to anchor anyone losing faith. She told me the case was strong, stronger than most she had seen, and that the defendants were already turning against each other behind closed doors. Hearing that didn't comfort me as much as it should have. Betrayal between them didn't erase what they'd done to me. It only proved that loyalty had never existed in that circle to begin with. The relative was the first to step into the witness box, looking smaller than I had ever seen, like a person trying to vanish inside their own skin. When questioned, his answers spilled out in fragments, half-truths collapsing into admissions. He spoke about pressure, about being convinced this was mercy disguised as necessity, about believing he was doing something protective. But when the prosecutor asked him the simplest question, the one that mattered more than any explanation, he broke. "Why didn't you ask your father what he wanted?" His voice cracked. "Because I was afraid he'd say no." That was it. Fear of hearing my refusal had been enough to justify drugging me, committing me, stripping my home out from under me. Not out of care, not out of concern, out of inconvenience. When the doctor testified, I felt the whole room brace for impact. He admitted he saw me once, admitted he didn't run full cognitive testing, admitted he accepted money for a diagnosis he barely bothered to confirm. The prosecutor asked if he understood the harm he had caused. He lowered his head like someone finally seeing the wreckage of his own actions. I didn't mean for it to go that far, but intent didn't matter anymore. The damage had already been carved into my life. Then they called the partner. She walked in with the same cold poise she'd worn through every earlier proceeding, But this time something in her posture betrayed tension, like the calculations running behind her eyes had started failing. She denied everything at first. She said she had no idea the documents were forged. She said she believed I was incapacitated. She claimed she was simply helping the man she loved navigate a painful situation. But then the messages surfaced. Lines she thought lived safely in private places. Take care of it before he realizes. The property will flip fast once he's fully settled. Make sure no one visits until the sale is finished. The jury leaned forward as each message hit the screen. Her expression tightened with every reveal. And when the prosecutor asked why the house was sold through layered companies all tied back to her name, the silence that followed was an admission all on its own. She tried to recover, stumbling through excuses, but the lies began collapsing under their own weight. The final witness was the previous victim, an older woman who carried a quiet strength that made the courtroom shift. She spoke softly but with a certainty that left no oxygen for doubt. She described being tricked, manipulated, isolated, convinced she could trust the very person dismantling her life. The pattern mirrored mine too perfectly to ignore. When she finished, the room felt hollow, like everyone had been forced to look at something ugly without being able to look away. Closing arguments came and went in a blur. The prosecutor spoke about dignity, about the cruelty of turning a parent into a profit plan, about the danger of people who prey on vulnerability instead of protecting it. The defense tried to paint everything as misunderstanding, miscommunication, concern taken too far. But the damage was too clear, the evidence too sharp. When the jury left to deliberate, time stretched thin and brittle. Minutes felt like hours. I sat there staring at the tabletop, tracing the grain of the wood with my thumb like it could steady me. And then they returned. Guilty. The word landed with a weight I had been carrying for months, suddenly lifted but leaving soreness behind. The relative was sentenced first 2 years. He turned, eyes red, lips trembling, but I looked away. Love doesn't erase consequences. The doctor received his sentence next. Then came the partner. 5 years. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She stared straight ahead like someone already planning who she would become after prison, who she would target next. But that wouldn't be my burden anymore. When the judge dismissed the courtroom, people filed out quietly, but I stayed seated for a moment, letting the air settle around me. It wasn't victory I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, heavier. The strange relief of knowing the worst had happened and I had lived through it anyway. Walking back into the house they returned to me felt like stepping into the echo of a life I remembered but couldn't fully touch anymore. The rooms were stripped bare. The walls still carried faint outlines where pictures had once hung, and the air felt too open, too empty, like someone had scooped out the center of everything that made the place mine. I stood there with the key trembling between my fingers, and it hit me all at once that you can win a battle and still feel the weight of what you lost. Nothing in the house made a sound except my own breath, uneven and thin, like I was afraid to breathe too deeply in case the memories cracked. I walked through each room slow, the way a person walks through a museum of their own past. Stopping at corners I once passed 100 times without thinking. There was a spot in the kitchen where the late partner used to stand cutting vegetables, humming under their breath. I pressed my hand to that section of counter, half expecting the warmth of another lifetime to still be there, but the surface was cold. Everything had been taken, sold, discarded. The sentimental and the practical all treated the same by people who never understood what any of it meant. For a moment I felt the sting rising behind my eyes, but I swallowed it down hard. Crying wouldn't bring a single thing back, so I started over. Estate sales, boxes of mismatched dishes, a chair with a wobbling leg I tightened with a wrench, lamps from a thrift store that flickered until I replaced the bulbs. Nothing matched. Nothing belonged. Together. But slowly the space began to feel lived in again. Not restored, not repaired, but reshaped by someone who refused to disappear. The neighbor came by, often carrying soup or bread or just her sharp opinions about the world. Sometimes she talked too much. Sometimes she sat quietly with me. Sometimes she argued with me just to prove I was still capable of being stubborn. And somehow those visits filled the space with something steadier than furniture ever could. During those months I thought a lot about boundaries, about how easily people talk themselves into crossing lines that don't belong to them. I replayed moments with the relative, tiny things I dismissed back then as worry or stress or care, now seen for what they were, small cracks forming long before the break. Every time my mind wandered toward forgiveness, a cold voice inside whispered, "Not yet, maybe never." Then the letter arrived 6 months after his release, neatly written, too polite, asking for a meeting, asking to talk, asking to fix something shattered. I set it aside without opening it for a full day. When I finally read it, the words felt like someone knocking gently on a door they once kicked open. Regret, apology, promises, invitations to rebuild. But trust wasn't a switch I could flip back on because someone suddenly wanted it. Trust is slow, fragile, earned with time and proved with action, not words written on paper by someone trying to outrun guilt. I didn't write back, not out of cruelty, not out of vengeance, but because healing sometimes means choosing silence over reopening wounds. People in town still asked about the whole ordeal from time to time. They'd bring it up in the grocery store or the post office, their voices dropping to whispers. They always asked if I regretted pressing charges, if I missed having family, if I felt lonely in that big house. The answer was complicated. I did feel lonely sometimes, especially at night when the quiet pressed too close and memories tried to fill the empty spaces. But loneliness wasn't worse than living under someone else's control. Loneliness wasn't worse than being erased. And regret never once visited me, not even for a minute. Love never required surrender. Family never meant allowing someone to dismantle your life piece by piece. People love to say blood is unbreakable, that you owe forgiveness simply because you share a history or a last name. But I learned the truth the hard way. Blood is not a shield. Blood is not a promise. Blood is not a prison you must stay locked inside. What matters is choice. Who shows up? Who protects instead of praise? Who stands beside you when everything cracks? Sitting on the rebuilt couch one evening with a mug of tea warming my hands, I listened to the quiet of the house, not the hollow quiet of before, but a calmer one, a quiet that belonged to me. I had survived, something designed to erase me. I had fought back when I was supposed to fade. I had reclaimed a home that almost became a weapon against me, and in that moment I realized surviving wasn't the end of the story. The real victory was building a life afterwards, one I chose, one I shaped, one no one could take.